For those who don't know me, my name is Mike Rogan, and I work in the Neil Agate Labor Studies unit. This seminar series is coordinated by those of us in NALSU, as well as the departments of History, Sociology, and Economics and Economic History. So, quite often in this seminar series, we host book launches, and that's, as you will have seen from the poster, the reason we're here today to launch this book. I'm very pleased to be a part of this book project myself. And let me just say a few things about the book before I hand it over to the book's editor. This is actually the first book on the South African informal economy or the informal sector since 1991. If any of you are interested in what people were saying about the informal economy in 1991, those contributions were largely about what's going to happen with the new government and whether it's going to change its position on informal sector employment in South Africa. So it was very forward-looking, very hopeful, and I think what you guys could probably appreciate is that a lot has happened since then. We might even argue that there's been something of a policy roller coaster over the informal sector since that time. This book tries to grapple with some of that, but also to give a really comprehensive look at what informal sector employment means in South Africa today. What I think is really interesting about the book is that the informal sector has become a preoccupation for a number of academic disciplines and across the political spectrum. If you do any sort of background reading on the informal sector, you'll see vast contributions from the very far right, the middle, and the left. And it's one of those interesting topics that attracts interest from all sort of ideological parts of the ideological spectrum. This book, I would suggest, contains a view from the middle, leaning towards the left, so missing that far right component. But what it does is it combines different viewpoints, and there's even a chapter which tries to explain the different perspectives from a both policy and ideological stance of informal employment. I think it also does quite a nice job of combining a regional and international perspective on the South African informal sector. We have authors who are experts in the regional dynamics of the informal sector, as well as authors who can say something about the informal employment globally and how South Africa fits into that sort of picture. Probably the third thing that I think is really useful about this book is that it's cross-disciplinary. I think in the end we had anthropologists, sociologists, historians, economists, and
geographers, statisticians, psychologists,
yeah. No medical people, but it could be a second volume. So it partly reflects the efforts of Frederick to bring in people from different disciplines and to grapple with this topic in a comprehensive way. I think you'll appreciate it's going to be difficult for him to summarize 17 chapters, so he's going to focus his presentation. But if you have a chance to pick up the book, I think you'll see immediately how wide-ranging it is in its perspectives on informal employment. And I think based on the sort of gap between the books, 1991 and 2018, you can probably appreciate there's a lot more that can be done. And I think Frederick's been quite open about this. This book scratches the surface, but is an attempt to bring this back into focus and provide maybe even a baseline in terms of scholarship on informal employment. So that's sort of my broad take on the book and where it fits in. Let me say something briefly about Frederick, and then I'll hand the floor over to him. He's previously a research affiliate of Salter at the University of Cape Town, and also at the University of Free State, where he was a professor of economics for many years, apart from a small break to be the vice chancellor of that university for about 10 years. And Frederick came to the attention of many of us when he left his administrative duties and focused very quickly back on content. And he dove straight into, in particular, employment in South Africa. And what caught his attention was a gap around informal employment, as he was looking at what scholars had been doing on the labor market while he was in university management. He then, through that, became one of the conveners or the principal investigators of the READY 3x3 project, which stands for the Research Project on Employment, Income Distribution, and Inequality.
Inclusive growth.
Inclusive growth. He guided the research focus on employment and unemployment. And within that, he started a group called the Informal Sector Employment Project. And through a series of workshops, commissioned research projects, this book came to fruition. So this is really the sort of culmination of 3 or 4 years of this group meeting to discuss our different disciplinary lenses on informal employment and talking through what we would want to say about our collaborations as a research group. And on a personal note, I would just like to say that it was absolutely fantastic working with Frederick. He has a way of getting to the nub of a research question or an issue. I only found out this afternoon that his nickname amongst his colleagues was "So What?" because he continually pushes to get it at the core of what we're saying, and it's amazing to have someone who can bring a project together who helps you to take your own work and to hone in on what's really important about it and why people should care, which is important if you're going to then try and sell them a book, right? So
okay.
You need to know what's important. So, Frederick, thanks for coming to Grahamstown on a massive loop from Bloemfontein, Johannesburg, Port Elizabeth, and then Grahamstown. It's great to have you here. Frederick's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll follow the usual format of questions until we're all tired of asking questions or all questions are answered. And the only other thing to add is that you'll have seen, especially students coming in, we're going to raffle 2 copies of this book to students during the question session. But also, Van Skijks is here. Thank you very much. They'll be selling books afterwards here. They have card facilities, and they're offering the book at a discounted rate. And that doesn't even include, I assume it could be autographed.
No, that's free.
At no extra cost. So thank you, Fred.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for being here. Are there any economists here? Get us. There's one. Okay, 2. That proves the point, okay? It's funny, I just realized, Mike, this whole story of mine, post-management, was started in PE, actually. In 2009, I got back from, first took a long break having been vice chancellor, just to become a normal human being again. And then I went to the Economic Society conference in 2009 in Nelson Mandela University. And I was there for 3 days. And after a while I said, well, what are these guys talking about? There were millions of papers, as you know. I mean, parallel and everything. Anyway, there was not one paper on unemployment or employment. Not one. Okay, lots of about inflation and everything else. Now, I don't want to belittle topics. People have their own interests. But it's quite amazing to me with our kind of unemployment rate of 25 or 37 or whatever you mentioned it, that nobody was reading on unemployment. There were some I think 2 or 3 labor economics papers, Vanilla and so there's some stuff, but nobody talks about it. So I asked around, guys, what's going on? Why is nobody working on unemployment? Anyway, I couldn't get an answer, but I started reading, somebody told me, go and read this paper as a start. And I did. And then it became a 2-year literature review in the end, a 100-page monograph, trying to answer the question, why is it not happening? It wasn't quite an answer necessarily, but one thing I gathered is that in economics, or maybe in all the sciences, you've got this sort of split. You've got some economists who are labor economists, and they silo and they talk about labor economic stuff, okay? And then you have poverty and development people working, and they do their stuff, but they never talk to the labor economists. And then you have the macroeconomists who do their own stuff, and the corporate guys, all these wives things they say about the recession, as if they know anything. But they never talk to the labor economists or the development and poverty people. And I think that's part of the answer where there's sort of a sterile debate. Nobody talks about it. The other thing is it's kind of a difficult thing. Nobody knows what to do about unemployment. You can have grand plans and job summits. It's really a difficult thing. So I'm not saying that facetiously. It's a difficult issue. How do you really change employment? Okay, or unemployment. But anyhow, following this READY project was launched about 2 years ago, with this focus on one area focusing on unemployment and employment, and trying to get people to focus on it. And at least we got about 30 papers outside the book now to work on that. But anyway, so it started in the Eastern Cape, so that's it's good that I come back here again. I didn't think of that actually, but I should have. Okay, so the informal sector, as you said, is a contentious area, or many people like nibbling there from many perspectives, and sometimes they don't allow other people to enter that territory, but anyhow, I think it's typically academics. But, okay, why did I go here? It's in my sort of big survey. I read some papers from Dory Quazle is the one, a few ones about the informal sector, but I sort of gathered there's a big gap. There's nothing being done about it, at least by economists, okay? It was a very empty hole, sort of, and so I got some people together and said, well, let's talk about it. And in the light of the fact that we had all this high unemployment and the lack of wage income, as we know, is a major factor in explaining poverty and inequality. So I thought it's kind of obvious everybody should work on unemployment. Okay, so we got this group together, and we had a fantastic group, as he said, multidisciplinary, different, qualitative, quantitative, everything. It was a fantastic experience to work in teams. I can recommend that. One head is a stupid thing, but 2 and 3 heads are much better. Okay, and it's been ignored mostly in policy. There are some chapters on that, and looking at the National Development Plan and places. Very little has happened in the last 10 or 20 years. There's a bit now happening, but not that much either. Okay. Some key messages of the book. Okay, so if you fall asleep now, just read this slide. Okay. Now, can I also say, I'm not the author of this book, okay? I was the editor. I wrote a number of chapters, but luckily I don't have to defend everything. But this is my attempt. The last chapter is sort of a synthesis chapter, trying to say, well, so what now? 17 chapters, 20 people all over the world wrote 500 pages. What does it say? Or if you want to read only one chapter, like many politicians or policymakers do, read the last chapter. And then it will feed you back to earlier chapters. Okay, so I recommend that to you as well. Okay, first point, making a bold statement. If we serious about tackling unemployment and poverty and inequality, it needs to take the informal sector seriously. It won't solve the problem, but if we don't look at it, a large part of the problem will not be solved or addressed. Okay, so it must be part of our response to these problems, an integral and integrated part. Okay, and one of the things we got in this project with new data that hadn't been used before is to see, well, there's really paid employees, lots of them in the informal sector. I'll get back to the detail. I won't talk, I'm just going to get to the main points. Thirdly, as a result, given its employment potential and performance, we must enable and support it. Okay? And a more dynamic informal sector can be a potent instrument to get inclusive growth. Again, it won't solve the whole problem. Okay, it'll require effective enabling policies, and the issue of formalization is here. Have you heard about that? Sort of a ILO directed international campaign almost to formalize the informal sector. Now, what that means and how it should be done, and is it the right thing, and can it work or will it work, is a big issue. And we make sort of the suggestion here of smart formalization, and what is that, and what is dumb formalization, okay? And if we don't do this, that's the point which the some-kind of message, it will remain the forgotten sectors, and especially among economists. I can say that when they're not here, okay? The few economists will not tell them a bit. Okay, basic key messages of the book, but this hides a lot of detail, and please, this is not all there is to it. Okay, just about why is it a forgotten sector? What one picks up if you talk to people who don't know much about it, they have this kind of picture of the informal sector, and they look down upon it. They say it's not worth spending time on it, put it crudely, okay? Sort of just retailers, the waste pickers, that's not the economy, you know, it's own account workers, it's not real businesses, perhaps a few unpaid family members helping out, they don't have skills. There are sort of findings of people that say no abilities, no ambition in the informal sector. and not much potential. Okay, so basically saying it's not worth spending time on it. Okay. And you read these things when you read writings on it from corporate economists or bank economists or even researchers. So this is kind of view that is not worth much in terms of the economy. Okay, so it has been at the margins of analysis. Some stuff has been done, but very little, and it's not taken seriously. Or if you look in some documents like the National Development Plan, the chapter on the economy and employment has nothing on the informal sector. There's one table where it says the informal sector should produce 202 million jobs, but in the analysis, not a word, not a single word. Okay? Some people say, well, it's just part of small business. Okay, and that's one of the issues. Is it just part of small business, or is it different? Does it need special treatment? Do we understand what's going on there? And this book tries to answer that question, I suppose. But if you look at the NDP in the social protection or social insurance chapter, there's a lot about it. Or even the rural development, there's a lot about it. But the chapter on employment doesn't mention it. It's kind of weird, isn't it? I often have the sense, driving past Kucha, ministers like cutting a ribbon in front of a Kucha, but not in front of a spaza shop. It doesn't have sex appeal. Politically, it doesn't get you mileage. They like the big stuff. And obviously the big stuff is important, but we know that the formal economy or the modern production techniques doesn't necessarily create much jobs. It's not very labor intensive. But anyway, so that's the kind of explanation why it's not taken seriously very much. Okay. Just one or two definitions quickly, in case everybody... So we're on the same page. The first chapter talks a bit about conceptual issues and definitions. Can I just say, if you're interested in this area, it's important to clarify it, to be aware of it, because it is, the concepts are used a bit loosely. And very often it leads to confusion or people misunderstanding each other or reading something into what somebody said because they use the concept a bit loosely. So it's informal sector, informal economy, informal employment, are they the same, are they different, what are the overlaps? So it's just generally, I want to be careful with that. Okay, informal enterprise is just, in terms of the stats, is a definition, but the general one internationally, it's about not being incorporated, not a company, and at least not registered formally as kind of a business, and not registered for taxation either. Okay, so it's unregistered enterprises. Some have employees, and some don't have employees, are one-person enterprises. So the whole institution is seen as informal. And it basically means all the relationships are informal. The employment relationship is informal, there's no contact. But the contact with suppliers also, there's no contact. Or with employees, there's no contact. Or with the landowner, there's no contact. Everything is informal and built on trust and functioning. But they function, part of the economy. Okay. One term I myself use sometimes is this idea to see them as seedling enterprises or not startup, but no, it's the wrong word. But seedling or embryonic enterprises, one must see they must be able to develop and become stronger, but see them as a struggling seedling enterprise. It's an enterprise, but in a certain phase of development and vulnerability almost. And that's not part of these sort of formal definitions, just to convey something about what it means to be informal. And the informal sector then is the collection of all informal enterprises. Owners, operators, employees, some are paid, some are not paid, family members helping out, and so on, in all economic sectors. People tend to think it's only street traders and waste pickers. It's not true. It's there in all the sectors, manufacturing, retail, agriculture, everything. Agriculture is sometimes left out because there's not good data about it, but we have a fantastic chapter from Ben Cousins of PLAS on estimating informal agriculture, informal farming. So if you're interested in that, go and look at that chapter. So this includes domestic workers, and also subsistence agriculture. No, it excludes subsistence agriculture and domestic workers. So it's enterprises. Okay, so it's not the shadowy economy or the illegal economy or the underground economy, all kinds of terms that one finds in the literature and even internationally being discussed. So just be careful when you read something, check out how they define what they do. Okay, this just another perspective on informal sector. There are, in the big debate globally, I hope this is correct, Mike, sort of three groups of informality. The one is informal sector employment. That's what we spoke about just now. Employment in informal enterprises. Okay, that's the owners as well as the employees, if any. And in this country, it's about 2.2 million. Okay, we'll talk about that just now. Then you have informal employment in formal enterprises. And that's not what this book is about. But that's another category of study, where people are sort of casual laborers or they're employed without contracts or without benefits and so on. We should talk about employment conditions in formal enterprises. And the whole issue of labor brokers and stuff is very much involved with that issue. But it's a different category of informality. Of course, those enterprises are formal. Their relationships, everything is formal contracts, except with these few people. We don't have employment contracts. And the third category is found in households, where you have informal employment, people working without contracts or benefits and so on. Okay. Sometimes people group all this together in some studies or some approaches, like I think informal employment covers all three of those. The informal economy, in some people understand that it covers all three of those. Sometimes it's only the first two. People are not always very precise about it. This book is about that category. Okay, about enterprises, informal enterprises, and the employment in them, within them. Okay. So again, just be clear. Just give you some indication of the size of the other two in this country. If you compare those two, the informal enterprise or informal sector employment is about 3 times as much as informal employees in formal firms. This is ILO now, about 2010, I think, was those studies. Okay. Okay, just some of the numbers. The bottom, we saw the number already, about 2.2 million. That is 2013, okay? The latest numbers from the quarterly labor force for this year is 2.9 million. Okay, so it's growing. But we work with this data because we had good data sets for those years. And just the interesting thing, we for the first time maybe looked in one of the chapters at how many one-person firms and how many of them have employees, okay? Which we call a multi-person firm. And so they have, those 300,000 have 750,000 of employees. So one may have a picture of the sector as being mostly one-person people, having a street trader or something, also called on-account workers. But it came up with the new data. We got this survey, the SESI survey, that there are many that have employees and many paid employees. And the striking, 1 in every 6 persons who work in this country work in the informal sector. So why does everybody ignore it, all the economists? It's 1 in every 6. Okay, it is an important portion of the economy. Okay. I think I've said this basically, importance of employment, just one number. These employing or multi-person enterprises employ more people than the whole mining sector, more than twice the number of employees than the mining sector. So from an employment point of view, I'm asking, well, why all the patients in the mining chart and not to this group? Obviously, mining gets foreign exchange and many things that they earn, but it's just kind of a striking number to think that there are twice as many paid employees and owners in the informal sector, in part of it even, than in the mining sector. Now, I hope that will get policymakers' attention, but I'm not sure it will work. But it's kind of striking, I think, the number to compare it. Okay. And the interesting thing is what we found is those group of enterprises that employ people have been growing since 2001. So, whereas in 2001, majority of the individuals were basically on-account workers, one-person enterprises. And about a third of the people worked in employing firms, multi-person firms. Okay? By 2013, it was sort of 50-50. So half of the people are working in firms that have employees. So one must recognize there's sort of a texture or composition change that has been happening. And the question obviously is what happened after that. And what does it say about policy and potential? But so we have two groups, and they are equally important in terms of creating jobs. Okay? But it's just the inside of the composition that becomes interesting. Okay. Secondly, it comprises much more than street traders and waste pickers. They're not unimportant, but that's not the whole sector. And sometimes people and politicians and policymakers tend to have that this is all there is to it. Whereas if you look at the numbers, and Mike and his colleague also had on the occupational composition of the informal sector, it's everywhere, in all sectors and in all kinds of occupations. So it is not merely street traders we're talking about. Not that they're unimportant, but there's much more to it. It's the whole economy, the same as in the formal sector. And they have different propensities to employ. And the construction sector, I think intuitively one understands that, has a high propensity to employ. Other thing is about being static. More than 500,000 jobs created in a 1 year period in the sector. More than 500,000, okay? And as you know, the sector has about 2.5 million, so it's a very large percentage of new jobs being created. Now the problem is they don't all survive, okay? But the point is, there's a lot of initiative, a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of ambition, people doing things, but it wasn't recognized. Okay, so there are two ways jobs can be created. The first is that existing small enterprises, informal enterprises, can expand their employment. Okay, and we see the numbers there. About of that 500,000, about a third, okay, but this came from expansion. Both initial one-person firms that expanded, or those that already were multi-person and got even more employees. Okay. Obviously, there's a loss of employment as well, and that's the policy issue. And then the other big source of new employment is entry of new enterprises into the informal sector. Okay, and that's about twice the number we had there. We have here more than twice. Came from entry of new enterprises. Both, again, entering as a single-person enterprise or entering as a multi-person enterprise. So the startups are both types there. And then an important number, about 40% of them closed down within 6 months, which is a very worrying trend, okay? So there's a lot of initiative and trying to survive and trying to make a business, but not high sustainability rates. So the question is why and what can we do about that? And I think that's where the policy issue comes in. Let's just summarize the source of new jobs between new entrants and, so let me not spend time on, I've said it already. Okay, another issue, apart from direct employment creation, is the poverty reducing impact. Now, Mike and a colleague from America, Paul Pichetto, did a very novel paper to estimate the impact of the loss of, say, 100 informal sector jobs compared to losing 100 formal sector jobs. And that's their conclusion. Okay? Losing 100 informal sector jobs has about the same poverty increasing impact as losing 60 to 80 formal sector jobs. Now that's a very important statistic, or the other way around, gaining it and so on, okay? So, informal sector jobs, sometimes in city areas you have the sense of street traders being chased away and rounded up, and as if it doesn't matter. Those numbers tell you that the loss of informal sector jobs have a huge impact on the households where those people work. So the poverty impact, or the impact of informal sector employment on poverty reduction then, is quite striking. And I was very surprised when you got this number actually. It's a huge impact. So that comes from that chapter. Just about inclusive growth then, which is the sort of in word at the moment. I feel strongly that inclusive growth is very often wrongly understood as only increasing the fruits of growth being spread around to more and more people in the form of grants or whatever. The way I understand it, it's about getting the poor to participate in employment, to actively be part of the economic processes of not just only grants and stuff, I want to exclude that, or education or health services, but they must be part of the economy. We must try to get the poor working. And that is what I call inclusive growth, and that's the UNDP, United Nations Development Program definition that I got into somewhere in a working paper. So again, the informal sector must be an important part of any inclusive growth strategy. The book has a lot about obstacles faced by informal sector enterprises, why they don't survive or why they struggle or not grow, okay? And there are many things. He didn't cover all the issues. Some came up in the data very strongly, and those are listed here. It's obviously sometimes, many of these have been mentioned in earlier surveys but I think we confirm statistically with good data the validity of those listings, earlier listings. But, okay, so the issue of, say, good locations, secure premises that are well serviced, electricity, water, internet, and safety, that you can lock up, and it's not in the home where it interferes with the household, that you have a sort of business area that is well supplied with services, comes up very strongly in all the analyses with qualitative and quantitative data. And then issues like bookkeeping skills. You can't monitor your business if you can't see it. And to be able to see what it's doing, you must have some numbers. It can be very simple, but you must have some numbers. And if you take some of the income for yourself to buy food every evening, which is nothing wrong with it, but you don't record it. You don't know how much is coming in and how much is going out, where is the business standing, is it surviving, is it not surviving. So your picture of you can't see your business if you don't have some numbers. And that comes out in the statistics, that those enterprises that separate their finances of the business from the household, and bookkeeping is a part of that, I'm not an accountant, makes a huge difference to those that their profitability, but also the tendency to employ people. So once they sort of see business like it's a separate location and the accounting helps them, they start seeing, okay, this business is doing that and I can do this to improve it and employ more people. Because it's sort of identifiable as an activity. So that seems to be an interesting thing, to have it as a self-standing or self-reliant institution. Then obvious things like lack of finance and credit and insurance, okay. Crime, harassment by local government, and we also did some macroeconomic analysis of the informal sector. Many people think the sector's job is to absorb people from the formal sector when there's a recession, like we're having now, say. It may have that impact, but it was clear from Mike did a paper on that, and I was also involved in another chapter on that. Like with a big recession like the one of 2008, the informal sector suffered more, disproportionately more than the formal sector. So it's not just a handy sort of mopping up thing, it suffers more even, so it needs consideration in managing macroeconomic policy, sort of reserve bank stuff and so on. Now, I'm sure they never think about the informal sector. Okay, the other set of constraints are structural constraints. In terms of the concentration of the economy, which makes entry difficult, which makes it difficult to enter supply chains, which causes entire sections of the consumer basket being dominated by large corporates. So there's no space. The space is crowded. So there are a lot of the stuff is about structural constraints, which are very difficult to address, but they have been identified. So we need to look at that. But it makes it much more difficult to get into the formal economy or to link up with the formal sector to supply, say, a formal supermarket for an informal trader or supplier to do that. So the integration of formal and informal also is quite a structural problem. Okay, what is also interesting about the book, it's got two chapters that focuses on the rural areas. One is about the rural town, it's one case study, but very interesting the dynamics between commercial agriculture, informal agriculture, and the informal sector in the village or in the town, and the markets and who sells where, what are the dynamics there, and how does it affect, first of all, the informal sector in that village, in that town, and then secondly, looking at the agricultural sector itself, and having informal farmers, and where do they sell their wares every month end or every week or every weekend, and the kind of markets where they sell and what kind of support is needed to get those markets to be better places to sell for the informal farmers. But it's about 500,000 estimated informal farmers that comes on top of that 2.5 million we had initially. So this is quite novel. It's the first time ever we've had this kind of, anybody's done this looking at the informal market, farmers sector, which obviously links up with rural land reform and the potential that it may have or not. Okay, so it's very interesting, those two chapters. Okay, just about the policy environment. Okay, we were trying not to show, we uncovered sort of evidence, which I've sort of briefly summarized now, that there's a lot of economic potential, a lot of economic drive, ambition and everything in the informal sector. Large numbers of jobs being created, many of them paid jobs, and a lot of initiative to create new jobs and new entry of firms or expansion, but that they have a hard time surviving. Okay? And they are struggling with many constraints and problems. Many of them are similar to formal sector small businesses, but many of them are unique to the informal sector. Okay, so what does policy do about it? I think I mentioned it. The NDP economics chapter doesn't mention it at all. And if you ask the authors, they say, well, he's part of small business, okay, which I think is kind of a copy-out. Well, the first draft of the NDP didn't even mention small business. I don't know if you know that. It didn't even mention small business. It was all about the sort of kuchas, or the big parts, large big business part of the economy. That chapter. Okay. Then we put in some comments, so they added a large section on small business, but no mention that this at least contains the informal sector in their view. Not a mention. Okay. But meanwhile, while that was being written, the DTI at that stage, Department of Trade and Industry, published a policy called the National Informal Business Upliftment Strategy. It has now been transferred to the Small Business Department, but it was the first national informal sector policy initiative ever. Okay, so it was an important step. One can have many problems with it and many comments on it, but at least somebody was looking at the informal sector as such and saying, well, it needs attention. The move to the Small Business Department wasn't necessarily good. Very low, limited capacity there and so on, but anyway, at least it is there, and they developed a sort of a roadmap document how to roll this out. It's unclear to what extent it is being used at the moment and so on, but at least there is a national policy now. Much of it, in the end, is happening on provincial and local government level, or should happen. Some provincial governments have extended programs, like Gauteng has a very active township development program. Now, township is not exactly the same as the informal sector. It includes formal enterprises, as you know, many supermarkets and many hardware stores. It's a mixed economy, that. It's not all informal, and that's part of the confusion sometimes, conceptual. But there are many initiatives surrounding the township economy and the cities. Okay, then you get to the local government where it really happens. And some cities have large initiatives. Durban had a lot, Cape Town, Johannesburg, some in Sub-Tshwane. But I think many of them are focused, say, only on street traders and almost controlling them. Part of it, and we'll get to that just now, I think, is that, just a moment, a large part of the local government approach is to control or chase away informal sector enterprises. It's not about development or supporting them necessarily. And so you know it's a huge issue with street traders and there's stuff being confiscated in city areas. So the local government focus thus far has been very narrow, actually. And again, an issue of capacity and not sure, they're not being sure how to deal with it. Part of this NIBUS policy is to entice provincial and local governments to give matching funds, sort of, and in that way build infrastructure like trading sites and so on for enterprises. But that hasn't worked. Nothing has come of it because the local and provincial governments haven't been forthcoming in working with national government or having funds available to use this facility, basically. Okay, so in the end, the last chapter, the argument becomes that the sector shouldn't be tolerated or ignored or chased away or hoping it will go away. It will not. It's part of the developing world, is likely to grow larger. Okay? So what do we say? Well, it should be supported. Have a developmental approach to it. Strengthen them. Help them to grow from seedling to being a stronger plant. With all the complexities around it. But it also means, as we said earlier, becoming standalone businesses with their own finances, their own location, and where they function as a business, at least somewhat separate from the household, so that they can be seen by the operator as a business. But the whole point of supporting and enabling rather than harassing and closing down. And that it could make a major difference to the opportunities for the poor to be included, like in inclusive growth, in real activities. Okay, just about formalization quickly, last word. This is a huge international movement. It focuses not in the formal sector really, it focuses on all three of those bars I had earlier, all forms of informal employment. That means also in households and also in the formal sector. And it's being introduced all over the world, also in this country. You'll hear about Resolution 204 if you read about this. That's the number, eh?
Yeah.
204. But again, in practice, in government circles, if you talk to them very often, they conceive of formalization just in the sense of they must register for tax and they must have a business license. That means controlling, which must be part maybe of it, but there's no supporting element, no enabling element in it. So there's a risk that the concept is misunderstood as just you have to register to get a license. And licensing, as you can understand, is a way to control or exclude people and give some licenses and others don't get licenses and so on. We're not saying there should be no regulation or anything, but it can be a very blunt instrument if you just think of formalization as in terms of either tax or business registration and there's no developmental or support element in it. Okay, and then I mentioned the tendency to confuse distinctions between informal sector employment, what the book is about, the seedlings I was speaking about, and informal employment, informal enterprises, which is something quite different. It's about Anglo-American having employees that they don't have decent contracts, which is very different from having a builder or a steel worker in a township having an informal business, and obviously the employment is also informal. It's not the same kind of problem. So that's perhaps my view is that the seedlings need nurturing, not oppression or suppression. The other form may need suppression, but seedlings are something different, and that one should understand the informal sector's employment issue being different from informal employment in formal enterprises, in corporates and so on. So the seedling analogy helps me to understand what I'm saying. I hope it's clear what I'm saying about it. And formalization, I would then argue, smart formalization would adopt the idea of development, okay, and seeing a spectrum of enterprises. And I just list a few names, either from using words that try to convey something, from an embryonic enterprise to a mature one. They may still be largely informal, but to have a view of a development trajectory of an enterprise. Now, that roadmap that I was speaking about of this NEBUS document in the Small Business Department talks about a spectrum or a trajectory of enterprises. So at least there's some link up there. But anyway, the spectrum also includes one-person enterprises and multi-person enterprises. Equally important, because we see that both are important for entry and for employment expansion. And all of them will be in various stages of entry, of survival, of just getting started, of being strong already, and have enough capital or not. And the policy must be nuanced and be aware of this whole spectrum. It's not just one thing you have in your mind, like a street trader or a waste picker. It must cover the whole spectrum, but some kind of developmental approach. And also recognizing that different enterprises have different aspirations. Let's talk about so-called survivalism and growth orientation. And people see those as positive or negative terms depending on who you talk to. But firms may have different aspirations. Somebody may be quite happy to be a one-person enterprise. Fine. Help them to be a good and survivable one-person enterprise. Others want to grow and have employees. Help them to do that. They have different aspirations, different growth orientations, and even different entrepreneurial attitudes. Some, entrepreneurship is not an easy thing. And that must be part of the policy package to be aware of these differences and to be nuanced to fit with that. Okay, so the last component of that, and I'm arguing that formalization, these elements like you must register or you must do this and do that and have a license, are good things. They can help people. If you're registered, you can maybe get a bank loan. If you're not registered, you can't. Okay? Don't force people to register. But when they're ready, when they want now to grow to the point, okay, now we want to get some finance, they'll say, well, okay, to need this, you need to register, but we'll help you. So registration becomes like a menu of things that you access when you need it. Not it's forced upon you to be registered and be controlled. It is stepwise things that the enterprise can access depending where it is on that trajectory of an enterprise. It's just a vague, not conceptual idea how to think of formalization and how it can be a constructive thing instead of a destructive thing which focuses on registration and paying taxes and being controlled. Okay. Just the book has many other things. You're not economists, if I gather most of you, okay? It covers all kinds of issues. Now, here's a list. I'm not going to read them. You know, it's about youth, about poverty, about women and gender, about employment conditions, which is part of the larger concept of informal employment, about education, about social grants, about specific industries. Say, how can we link up the informal enterprise with the formal enterprise in the supply chain, say? Structural constraints, specific initiatives, say in home building or so on, where there may be much potential. How the sector is affected by recession, urban land reform. You know, there's lots in the air today about urban land reform. How are we going to do the urban planning in those areas? Will there be fixed areas for enterprises? Will there be places where they can say, oh, will it just happen? Will there be structuring? Will urban planning take it into account? The whole spectrum of enterprises. And rural land reform, obviously, we spoke about that. So there are many topics. Rural town development. Okay, that's basically it. Okay. And if you want to do more research, I've got a long list of topics, which you can imagine. There's so much to do once you get interested. Again, 1 in every 6 persons who work in the sector. It's worthy of research. It's worthy of social scientists like you looking at it seriously. Because that's where the poor people try to survive. Not only there, but many of them try to survive here. And it's high time it gets serious treatment from academics and from policymakers. So, buy the book. It's cheap. I'm not really selling it, but I'm just saying it's 290 Rand for that book. It's very cheap. It was subsidized by the project. So it's really accessible. And hopefully you'll find something interesting there. And you're looking for the thesis topic or something. I'm going to say a bit of marketing again. The project Ready has a online web policy website called econ3x3.org, which writes everything in plain language, accessible to even economists. The last chapter of this book was published there as a series of 5 shorter pieces. So if you want to read something quickly, go to econ3x3.org and read. You'll see them there. It's just a bit more of what I said today, I suppose, but it's a place to start. The whole book may become electronically available, but we don't know yet when. Okay, my last point is, I said 9 years ago I was here in PE and discussed it with the fact that economists weren't even looking at unemployment. We had a big project about unemployment, the READY project. I don't think much has changed. Academics are stuck in their silos and their ways of doing things and want to be promoted. And it's something all over the world, I suppose. And I have the sense that people are sometimes dancing around the problem and not tackling it. And as I said, it's a difficult issue. Nobody really knows how to get growth and how to get employment and what to do. But I have a sense sometimes that a lot of the academic energy is going into topics that are easy to measure and you can do all kinds of fancy things, but you don't get to the coal face to do something about it. I don't have an answer I can't tell you what to do. But I'm saying, just to be provocative a bit, that the unemployment is going to kill us all if we don't stop dancing around the problem and really try to make our hands dirty and get projects going in your town here, in your township here, and to really start using some of this knowledge and building on that and adding your own knowledge and own experience and own research skills. But really helping to make things happen. Otherwise we'll all get our masters and PhDs and happily go along and nothing would have changed. It can easily happen. And so my appeal to all of you is make your hands dirty and let's tackle those problems. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Frederick.